There is a moment, somewhere in the cold gray light before dawn, when 50,000 men have to answer the same basic call at the same time. Not the call of battle, not the call of their chieftains, the other one, the one no saga bothered to record. And that silence, that enormous, conspicuous absence in the historical record, tells us something important about how we have always chosen to remember warriors. We remember the axe, the longship, the raid, the carved runestone standing in a field somewhere in Sweden, proclaiming the name of a man who crossed the sea and never came back. We remember the shield wall, the screaming, the fire on the monastery roof. We do not remember what 50,000 men did with their waste every morning for weeks on end, camped on foreign soil, eating poorly, sleeping in damp wool, their bodies grinding through the physical labor of staying alive in a military force with no plumbing, no sewage, and no privacy worth mentioning. But that question, unglamorous as it is, gets at something real about how these forces actually functioned. Because an army that cannot manage its own waste does not stay an army for long. It becomes a disease camp. And disease has ended more military campaigns in human history than enemy blades ever did. Not by a small margin, by an overwhelming one. So the question deserves a serious answer, and the answer, it turns out, is more organized, more pragmatic, and more revealing than you might expect. The Viking Age stretched broadly from the late 8th century through the mid-11th. During that span, Norse forces operated across an enormous range: coastal England, Ireland, Francia, the rivers of Eastern Europe, the Mediterranean shore. They raided, they settled, they traded, and at various points they assembled in large coordinated forces that required sustained logistical management over weeks, months, and sometimes multiple consecutive winters. The number 50,000 is worth addressing directly. Individual raids were typically small: a few ships, a few dozen men, a quick strike on an undefended settlement, and a fast retreat to open water. But the larger campaigns of the 9th and 10th centuries were different in kind. The Danish Great Heathen Army that invaded England beginning in 865 was a substantial, coordinated force, likely numbering in the low thousands, though exact figures remain contested. Whatever the exact number, the sanitation logic holds at any scale. More bodies mean more waste, more contamination risk, more organizational pressure on a system with no margin for failure. A force of 5,000 men produces somewhere between 5 and 10,000 pounds of human waste per day under normal conditions. At home in Scandinavia, Norse communities handled sanitation in ways that archaeology has partially recovered. Excavations at Hedeby, the major Viking Age trading center in what is now the Schleswig region of northern Germany, have revealed latrine structures positioned at deliberate distances from the main living and commercial areas. Simple pit installations, sometimes lined with rough timber or wicker to stabilize the walls, located downhill from the wells and food preparation areas that the settlement depended on. The same spatial logic appears at Jorvik, Norse York in northern England, where the extraordinary Coppergate excavations recovered one of the most detailed pictures of Viking Age domestic life that archaeology has produced anywhere. Designated waste areas positioned at a consistent remove from sleeping and cooking spaces were part of the functional order of Norse settled life. None of this required germ theory. It required observation. Communities that separated their waste from their water survived at higher rates than communities that did not. That knowledge traveled with every Norse force that sailed away from home. The real challenge was not the homestead, it was the campaign. Weeks or months on unfamiliar ground, with no established infrastructure in territory where the locals were decidedly uncooperative, and time often did not permit careful setup. When a Norse force landed on an unfamiliar coast and established a camp, the first priorities were defense and shelter. The sagas note the placement of sentries, the councils of war, the distribution of captured livestock. They do not describe where the latrines were dug, but they must have been dug. The logic was as absolute as hunger. The evidence for organized field sanitation in this period comes less from Norse sources directly and more from the broader pattern of early medieval military practice, combined with what the Norse archaeological record tells us about settled life. The universal field solution, documented across multiple cultures spanning centuries of pre-modern military history, was the trench latrine, a long, narrow pit excavated at a designated distance from sleeping areas, food storage, and water sources, used collectively, covered periodically with soil or ash to reduce odor, slow fly breeding, and prevent direct contact. When a trench filled, it was sealed and a new one opened. The minimum safe distance from water that appears in later medieval military regulation, roughly 200 feet in some contexts, likely reflects accumulated experience rather than formal invention, a rule that codified what observation had already taught. For a Norse encampment, the specific approach depended entirely on terrain. Sandy or loamy soil could be dug quickly with the basic ironwork any traveling force carried: hand axes, short spades, the functional tools that appear consistently in Viking-age archaeological deposits and that served equally as weapons, camp tools, and construction implements depending on the hour. Rocky or frozen ground was a harder problem. In winter conditions, and Norse forces operated regularly through northern European winters, digging through frozen earth required time and labor that was not always available in the opening days of a new camp. In those conditions, other solutions applied. Snow cover was used as a temporary disposal medium, with waste buried at the camp's edge and the understanding that spring melt would carry it away from the water supply. Running water was both asset and risk simultaneously. A camp beside a river benefited from flow. Waste directed into downstream current dispersed quickly. That same river was the camp's primary drinking source. The solution was spatial: drinking water drawn from upstream, waste directed downstream. The logic required no formal instruction, just the common sense of men who had grown up near water. When that logic broke down, when a camp was established in unfavorable terrain, when discipline degraded under sustained pressure, when the force was moving too fast to maintain consistent practice, the results were predictable. Waterborne illness does not announce itself immediately. The incubation period for enteric infections runs from 2 days to 2 weeks, which means contamination at the water supply might produce no visible symptoms for a week or more. By the time men started falling sick in numbers, the source was often already distributed throughout the camp's food and water systems. Dysentery, whether bacterial or amoebic, produces severe intestinal symptoms, fluid loss, and weakness that can render a man incapable of effective military function within 48 hours of onset. Typhoid fever, which spreads through the same fecal-oral route, kills between 10 and 30% of untreated populations. Neither required an enemy. Both were generated entirely by the internal logistics of keeping large numbers of people in close proximity without adequate sanitation. There is no way to calculate how many Norse campaigns underperformed because of disease rather than military failure. The physical logistics of camp sanitation were shaped in hierarchy in ways worth acknowledging. A Norse military force was not a democratic collective. It had jarls and leaders of recognized standing, experienced veterans with established reputations, and at the lower end, younger fighters, recently joined men, and the thralls and support workers who traveled with any large force. The digging of latrine trenches, the maintenance of waste areas, the unglamorous physical labor that kept a camp functional, this work fell disproportionately on those with the least standing, not because anyone necessarily announced it as policy, because that is how labor hierarchies function in military settings across cultures and centuries. The low-status work goes to the lowest-status men. The longship voyage itself, often the first phase of any campaign, established the physical baseline before the men reached land. A vessel comparable to the excavated Gokstad ship ran approximately 23 meters in length with a crew of 30 to 40 men. That crew occupied the hull along with weapons, armor, food stores, water containers, and whatever additional equipment the mission required. Men sat at rowing benches, slept where space allowed between those benches, and used their cloaks as bedding on chest tents that doubled as storage. There were no partitions, no below-deck quarters, no privacy of any kind. Toilet arrangements on such a vessel during a voyage of several days were, by necessity, entirely direct. Liquid waste went over the side. Solid waste required either going over the side, no small feet in rough water, or using a container emptied overboard. Evidence from Northern European maritime traditions suggests the use of wooden buckets or clay vessels as portable latrine containers aboard working vessels. These were shared resources, not individual arrangements. Privacy was simply not a category that applied to long-ship life. The social norms around bodily function at sea were entirely pragmatic, and the men who went raiding had grown up in communities where a degree of shared physical existence was the normal condition of life. What this meant practically was that a force arriving on a foreign coast after a week at sea was already carrying significant biological load: intestinal parasites, skin conditions from saltwater exposure, muscle fatigue from rowing, before the work of establishing a camp even began. Personal hygiene in the Norse context occupies an interesting position in popular history. The combs are real. They appear consistently across Norse archaeological deposits, in graves, in settlements, in the refuse deposits of trading centers and military sites. Made from antler, bone, or wood, functional rather than decorative in most cases, they were used daily. Combing the hair and beard regularly was a practical health measure because lice, which are universal in pre-modern archaeological contexts, transmit bacterial diseases, including typhus. A man who combed his hair each day was not primarily performing grooming in any modern sense. He was managing a genuine medical risk. The comb was, in a real sense, one of the more important items in his kit. The Saturday bath, laugardurk in Old Norse, literally washing day, is a genuine linguistic survival suggesting a weekly bathing practice of cultural weight. In the settled home environment, heating water in sufficient quantity required a hearth, containers, and time. All of those were available at home. On campaign, they were not. A force moving quickly or a camp under tactical pressure did not stop to heat bathing water for several thousand men. What was achievable in the field was limited: hands rinsed before handling food, face and neck cleaned when river water was close, hair combed to manage lice. The gap between the hygiene practices that Norse culture valued at home and what was achievable in a prolonged field campaign was real. The men who returned from a winter in England were not clean. The intestinal parasite data from the York deposits makes this concrete in a way that cultural description alone cannot. Analysis of the Coppergate cesspits identified substantial quantities of preserved parasite eggs, whipworm and roundworm predominating, in the organic material. This was not unusual filth. It was the normal biological condition of people living in close proximity without modern sanitation infrastructure. Parasitic infection was near universal in the early medieval world. In a military camp setting, parasitic load would have been heavier than in settled life. The effects were chronic rather than acute: fatigue, reduced nutrient absorption, mild but continuous drain on immune function, slower recovery from wounds. Ash deserves specific attention as a sanitation resource because it appeared at the intersection of the most ubiquitous feature of any Norse camp and one of its most pressing practical needs. Fire burned continuously in any camp of significant size, for cooking, for warmth in northern winters, for smoking food, for heating water. A continuous fire in northern conditions produces substantial quantities of wood ash. Ash absorbs moisture, reduces odor, and has mild antibacterial properties. None of these were understood in chemical terms in the Viking Age. All of them could be observed empirically by anyone paying attention to the problem. Spreading ash over a latrine area made it less unpleasant, easier to work around, and simpler to cover when a trench was ready to be sealed. What does all of this tell us about the Norse as a military force? It tells us, first, that they were more organized than the mythology suggests. The popular image of the Viking as a creature of pure aggression, contemptuous of logistics, indifferent to the material conditions of campaign life, is a construction, partly the product of hostile contemporary sources that had every reason to emphasize Norse irrationality, partly the result of the saga's own selective attention to the honorable and dramatic over the operational and routine. Men who sailed thousands of miles in wooden vessels, who established trade networks from Dublin to the Black Sea, who maintained military presence in foreign territory across multiple consecutive seasons, who built the geometrically precise Trelleborg fortresses. These were not people who ignored logistics. They had developed logistics sophisticated enough to make those achievements possible. It tells us, second, that the relationship between military effectiveness and unglamorous practical systems was as true in the Viking Age as in any other period. The axe wins the battle. The latrine trench makes the axe possible. And it tells us, third, that every man in those camps, whatever his reputation, whatever deeds he would later have recorded, was navigating the same biological reality, the same cold mornings, the same chronic parasitic burden, the same smell of a camp occupied too long without moving. The saga heroes were bodies before they were heroes. They performed the same unglamorous daily maintenance that kept those bodies functional enough to do the things the sagas chose to remember. The archaeology of Norse sanitation continues to develop through the patient analysis of organic deposits that earlier excavators would have discarded as undifferentiated waste. What that picture shows is a people who were neither indifferent to cleanliness nor somehow exempt from the biological realities of pre-modern life. They brought practical knowledge with them wherever they sailed. They applied it under conditions that made it difficult: frozen ground, hostile territory, the time pressure of a campaign, the spatial constraints of a coastal encampment. They adapted what was available. They dug the trenches, used the moss, burned the ash, drew water from upstream and directed waste downstream. They combed their hair, kept their weapons maintained, and probably smelled, by any modern standard, profoundly unpleasant. And then they went to war anyway. The warrior in the saga has a name. He has a sword with a name. He has deeds carved into stone. The latrine trench has no name. No saga celebrates it. No runestone was raised for the men who dug it in the gray cold before the rest of the camp woke. But it was there. It had to be. And the campaigns that held together through a second winter in foreign ground succeeded in part because someone understood that the distance between where you sleep and where you relieve yourself is not a trivial footnote. It is the difference between an organized fighting force and a field of sick men who cannot stand. The Norse understood this. They may not have written it down, but 50,000 men, season after season, from the rivers of Ireland to the Black Sea, that is not luck. That is the accumulated practical intelligence of a culture that grasped, without a single word of theory, that survival requires more than courage. It requires the unglamorous work too. If this side of history interests you, the systems, the logistics, the daily physical reality the sources left behind, there is far more here than most people expect. The gaps in the record are often where the most human stories live.